A stranger slipped a photo into my bag at airport security. When I looked at it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, asleep on an airplane, taken from the seat behind me. I flipped it over and the back said in handwritten letters, "Don't board flight 237. I pulled out my boarding pass with shaking hands. My flight number was 237. My name is Iris Palmer. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a software engineer in Seattle. I was traveling alone that morning to Miami for a work conference, something I'd done twice before without any problems. The woman who slipped the photo into my bag was in her 50s, with gray hair and a dark coat. I didn't know who she was then, and I had no idea she was about to save my life. My younger sister Leah is 29 and teaches elementary school. We talk every single day. My dad Robert is 62 and used to be an airline pilot for 30 years before he retired. He's the one who taught me to trust my instincts, even when they don't make logical sense. If you want to hear how a photograph from a complete stranger stopped me from boarding a plane that turned into a national news story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because this story will change how you think about ignoring your gut feelings. I'm a pretty logical person. I work with computers and code all day, so I like things that make sense and follow clear rules. I don't believe in psychics or superstitions or any of that stuff, but I am a nervous flyer, and that started 5 years ago when my mom died in a car accident. Ever since then, I've been hyper-aware of worst-case scenarios and safety risks. My dad spent 3 decades flying commercial jets, and he always tells me that flying is literally the safest way to travel, statistically speaking. My sister Leah thinks I worry too much about everything and need to relax more. She's probably right, but I can't help how my brain works. The morning everything happened, I woke up at 4 in the morning to catch a 7:30 flight to Miami. I was exhausted because I'd stayed up late the night before finishing a presentation for the conference. I called an Uber, got to SeaTac Airport around 5:30, and headed straight to the security checkpoint. It was a normal early morning at the airport, moderately busy with business travelers and families starting their vacations. I was wearing comfortable clothes for the flight, jeans and my favorite gray hoodie. I had my laptop bag and a small rolling suitcase. I'd already checked in online the night before and had my boarding pass saved on my phone. Flight 237, non-stop to Miami, seat 14C. Nothing about the morning felt unusual or strange. I went through the security line doing the same routine I always do. I took off my shoes, emptied my pockets, pulled my laptop out of my bag, and placed everything in the gray bins. I walked through the scanner with my arms up, waited for the OK signal, and then started gathering my stuff on the other side. That's when it happened. While I was sitting on a bench putting my shoes back on, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a long, dark coat brushed past me. She mumbled a quick apology and kept walking fast toward the gates. I barely looked at her. People bump into each other at airports all the time. I finished tying my shoes, put my laptop back in my bag, and started walking toward my gate. As I walked through the terminal, I noticed my bag felt slightly different, like something had shifted inside. I opened the front pocket to check, and that's when I found it. A photograph I'd never seen before. It was a regular 4x6 printed photo, the kind you'd get developed at a drugstore. When I looked at the image, I stopped walking right in the middle of the concourse. The photo showed someone asleep in an airplane seat, head tilted against the window, eyes closed, wearing a gray hoodie. It took me several seconds to realize I was looking at myself. I recognized everything. The hoodie I was wearing right now, my hair, the small scar above my left eyebrow, the necklace I always wear with my mom's initial on it. But I had absolutely no memory of this photo ever being taken. I'd never seen it before in my life. My hands started shaking as I turned the photo over. Written on the back in neat, careful handwriting were 7 words that made my heart stop. "Don't board flight 237. I stood there frozen while people walked around me. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and opened my boarding pass. Flight 237 to Miami, departing at 7:30. This was my flight. Someone had just given me a warning about the exact flight I was about to board. I stood frozen in the middle of the airport concourse while hundreds of people rushed past me on both sides. My logical brain immediately started trying to find rational explanations for what I was holding. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank from one of my coworkers who knew I was flying today. Maybe someone had photoshopped my face onto another person's body as a joke. But the more I studied the photo, the more real it looked. I could see tiny details that would be impossible to fake. The exact fabric pattern of the airplane seat behind me, the wing visible through the window, the specific way my hair fell across my shoulder. This wasn't photoshopped. This was a real photograph of me sleeping on an actual airplane, and I had zero memory of when it could have been taken. I spun around looking for the gray-haired woman who'd bumped into me, but she'd completely disappeared into the crowd of travelers. My first instinct was to call my dad, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep, asking if everything was okay. I told him everything as fast as I could, my words tumbling over each other. I described the photo, the warning message on the back, the fact that it was my exact flight number. There was a long pause on the other end. My dad asked me to take a picture of the photograph and text it to him immediately. I did, my hands still shaking so badly I had to take 3 tries to get a clear shot. Another pause while he looked at it. Then he started asking very specific questions in his pilot voice, the one he used when something was serious. What could I see in the background of the photo? What was the seat configuration? Were there any airline markings visible anywhere? I described everything I could see in detail. My dad went quiet again, and then his voice got harder and more serious than I'd heard in years. He said the seat fabric pattern and the configuration I was describing matched the Boeing 737-800 aircraft that my airline used for the Seattle to Miami route. This wasn't some random stock photo someone pulled off the internet. This came from a real flight. My dad told me directly not to board that plane. He said he didn't care how crazy it sounded or how inconvenient it would be, but something about this entire situation was deeply wrong. Someone had taken a photo of me while I was asleep and vulnerable on an airplane. Someone knew my flight number for today. Someone went through the trouble of printing a physical photograph and deliberately sneaking it into my bag as a warning. He said in his 30 years of flying commercial aircraft, he'd learned to trust his instincts about safety above everything else, and every alarm bell in his head was going off right now. I felt completely torn. I had an important presentation at this conference that my boss was counting on me to deliver. Missing this flight meant missing the entire first day of the conference. But my father's tone was something I'd never heard before. He wasn't just concerned. He was genuinely frightened for me. I started walking slowly toward gate C12, where flight 237 was supposed to board. I had about 20 minutes before they'd call my boarding group. I found a seat near the gate and studied the photograph again under the better lighting. That's when I noticed something I'd completely missed before. In the background of the photo, barely visible in the reflection on the airplane window, there was part of someone's face, just their eyes and forehead, the person who'd taken the picture. The eyes looked strangely familiar, but I couldn't figure out why. Then I noticed something else. At the very bottom corner of the photo, printed in tiny numbers, was a date and time stamp. The photo had been printed yesterday at 3:47 in the afternoon at a Walgreens pharmacy. Someone had printed this photo less than 24 hours ago, specifically to give to me this morning. I looked up at the gate area and watched the other passengers waiting to board. There were families with small children coloring in activity books, business travelers typing on laptops with their coffee cups beside them, an elderly couple holding hands and looking at a travel magazine together. Everyone looked completely normal and unaware. The departure board above the gate showed Flight 237 was on time and would begin boarding in just 8 minutes. I called my sister Leah, and she answered right away, immediately asking what was wrong because I never called her this early. I explained everything about the photo and the warning. Leah's first reaction was that I was overthinking things, that it was probably just an elaborate prank from someone. But when I texted her the photo, she went completely silent for almost 30 seconds. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. She said the photo was definitely me and definitely real, no question about it. She told me I should show it to airport security or talk to the gate agent immediately. I stood up and walked to the gate counter where a woman named Sandra Kim was typing something into her computer. I showed her the photograph and explained what had happened at security. Sandra's expression shifted instantly from polite customer service mode to genuine concern. She picked up her phone and made a call to airport security. Within 5 minutes, 2 TSA officers in uniform arrived at the gate. I had to explain the entire story from the beginning again, while they examined the photo closely and wrote down my information. The TSA officers asked me to come with them to review security footage from the checkpoint where the woman had bumped into me. We walked through a series of hallways behind the public areas until we reached a back office filled with monitors, showing different camera angles of the entire security checkpoint. One of the officers sat down at the computer and started rewinding the footage to around 5:45 when I'd gone through security. I watched the screen as the footage played back. There I was, placing my bags on the conveyor belt, walking through the scanner, and then sitting down on the bench to put my shoes back on. Then the gray-haired woman in the dark coat appeared. She was standing very close to my bags as they came off the conveyor belt. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but it clearly looked like her hand went into the front pocket of my bag for just a second before she turned and walked away quickly. The TSA officer zoomed in on her face, but she was wearing large sunglasses and a hat pulled low, making it nearly impossible to see her features clearly. They switched to other camera angles, trying to track where she went after leaving the security area, but she seemed to disappear into the crowd near the restrooms and never appeared on any other cameras. The TSA officers contacted the airline directly, and Sandra's supervisor came to join the discussion at the gate. They pulled up the complete passenger manifest for Flight 237, which showed 156 people booked on the flight. The supervisor had a quiet conversation with Sandra and the TSA officers, while I stood there feeling completely helpless. Finally, the supervisor turned to me and explained that they take all potential security threats very seriously, but without a specific credible threat against the aircraft itself, they couldn't legally delay or cancel the entire flight. However, they could rebook me on a later flight to Miami at absolutely no charge if I felt uncomfortable flying on Flight 237. I stared at the photo in my hands again. My logical brain kept saying this was probably nothing, probably just some sick prank by someone with too much time on their hands. But my gut, that same instinct my father always told me to trust above everything else, was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The person who took this photo had access to me while I was unconscious and asleep. That person somehow knew my exact travel plans for today. That person had gone through elaborate effort to warn me specifically. I looked at Sandra and told her I wouldn't board Flight 237. I asked her to put me on the next available flight to Miami instead. Sandra nodded with what looked like relief and immediately started typing on her computer to rebook me. Over the airport speakers, I heard the final boarding call for Flight 237. I turned and watched through the gate windows as the last few passengers walked down the jetway, including the young mother with 2 small children I'd seen earlier. A wave of panic hit me. Should I say something to them? Should I make a scene and tell everyone not to board? But what would I even say? That I had a creepy photo and a bad feeling. The TSA had already determined there was no credible threat to the aircraft. The jetway door closed with a heavy thunk. Through the window, I watched Flight 237 push back from the gate right on schedule. The plane turned and started taxiing slowly toward the runway. I pulled out my phone and called my dad back. When he answered, I told him I didn't get on the plane. I could hear the relief flood through his voice, even over the phone. Sandra finished rebooking me and handed me a new boarding pass. The next flight to Miami was at 11 in the morning, which meant I had a 3.5-hour wait ahead of me. I thanked the TSA officers for taking me seriously and walked to find a coffee shop. I bought the largest coffee they had and found a seat near my new gate, where I tried to work on my laptop, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept pulling out the photo and staring at it, trying to understand what it meant and who had given it to me. I texted my boss explaining that I'd missed my original flight due to a security issue, but would be arriving on the 11 o'clock flight instead. I didn't mention the photo because saying it out loud made me sound completely insane. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. I kept obsessively checking the flight tracking app on my phone. Flight 237 should have been somewhere over the Carolinas by now, cruising at 35,000 feet. Everything looked normal on the app. The flight was on time and proceeding normally to Miami. I started to feel genuinely foolish. Maybe Leah had been right from the start. Maybe this was just an elaborate prank and I'd fallen for it completely. I'd wasted hours of my time, missed an important flight, and probably looked like a paranoid crazy person to everyone at the airport. Then, at exactly 9:17 in the morning, I heard a commotion at a service desk about 30 feet away from where I was sitting. An airline employee was on the phone and her face had gone completely pale. Other employees quickly gathered around her, all of them looking shocked and worried. My heart started pounding hard before I even knew why. I stood up and walked closer to the service desk, my legs feeling shaky and weak. I could hear fragments of the phone conversation the airline employee was having with someone. The words, emergency landing, and Orlando, and medical emergency on board, reached my ears. I approached the desk and asked which flight they were talking about. The employee looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and said Flight 237 had declared an in-flight emergency and diverted to Orlando International Airport. Multiple passengers had become violently ill during the flight and were showing symptoms of severe distress. The plane had landed safely, but paramedics were meeting the aircraft right now. I felt like the floor had disappeared under my feet. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. That was my flight. I was supposed to be on that plane right now. If I hadn't listened to the warning, if I hadn't trusted my instincts and my father's advice, I would be one of those sick passengers being met by paramedics. Within 20 minutes, the situation was all over every television screen in the airport. The local news had picked up the story and it was spreading fast. The headline read that Flight 237 from Seattle to Miami had made an emergency diversion to Orlando after multiple passengers fell ill with what authorities suspected was food poisoning or possible deliberate contamination. 12 passengers had been taken off the plane and transported to local hospitals. The CDC and FBI were being called in to investigate whether this was accidental contamination or something more sinister. The news showed live footage of the plane sitting on the tarmac in Orlando, surrounded by emergency vehicles with their lights flashing. I stood in front of the TV screen, unable to move or breathe properly. That could have been me. I would have been one of those 12 people rushed to the hospital if I'd ignored that photograph and boarded like I was supposed to. 2 TSA officers found me standing in the terminal and asked me to come back to the security office immediately. This time the room was much more crowded. There were more TSA supervisors, airport police, and 2 people in suits who identified themselves as FBI agents investigating the Flight 237 incident. They wanted to see the photograph again and hear everything I could remember about the woman who'd given it to me. I told them every detail I could recall, but honestly, it wasn't much. Gray hair, dark coat, sunglasses, maybe in her 50s, moved quickly and deliberately. They pulled up the security footage again, and this time FBI analysts studied it frame by frame. They isolated the clearest image of the woman's face and started running it through facial recognition databases. One of the FBI agents asked me a question that seemed strange at first. She asked if I'd ever been on a flight before where there was any kind of incident or emergency. I thought hard and said no, never anything unusual. But then something clicked in my memory, like a light switching on. 3 months ago, I'd flown to Denver for a work trip. It had been an early morning flight, and I'd been so exhausted that I'd taken a sleeping pill, something I rarely did. I'd slept through the entire flight, which was unusual for me since I'm normally too nervous to sleep on planes. I woke up as we were landing feeling groggy and disoriented. That's when the photo must have been taken. Someone sitting in the seat directly behind me on that Denver flight had photographed me while I was unconscious. I told the FBI agents about this memory, and they immediately asked for the flight number and exact date. I pulled up my email and found the confirmation from 3 months ago. It was Flight 891 to Denver. They started typing furiously on their computers, pulling up the passenger manifest from that old flight, and cross-referencing it with today's Flight 237 manifest to see if anyone had been on both flights. Suddenly, one of the FBI agents straightened up in her chair and called the others over to her screen. They'd found a match. A woman named Helen Vance had been a passenger on both my Denver flight 3 months ago and was also listed as being at the airport this morning, though she hadn't boarded any flight. They pulled up her employment records. Helen Vance had worked as a flight attendant for the airline for 22 years with a completely clean record. But 6 months ago, her adult daughter had been killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. According to her file, Helen had taken a medical leave of absence for grief counseling and had only returned to work 3 months ago. They pulled up her employee ID photo and turned the screen toward me. I looked at the picture and my hands started shaking all over again. Those eyes. Those were the exact same eyes I'd seen reflected in the airplane window in the photograph. Helen Vance was the woman who took my picture on the Denver flight. Helen was the woman who'd slipped the warning into my bag this morning. The FBI agents made rapid phone calls and started piecing together what had actually happened. Helen Vance wasn't scheduled to work Flight 237 today, but security footage confirmed she'd been at the airport early this morning. They tracked her movements through various cameras and saw that she'd gone through security, but had never boarded any flight. She'd been there specifically to find me and give me that warning. Helen Vance was arrested at her home in Seattle just 3 hours after Flight 237 made its emergency landing in Orlando. According to the FBI agents who called to update me, she didn't resist or try to run. She confessed to everything immediately. She told investigators that after her daughter died 6 months ago, she'd fallen into a depression so deep that she could barely function. She became obsessed with the randomness of tragedy, with how innocent people die while the people responsible walk away with minor consequences. The drunk driver who killed her daughter only got 18 months in jail. Helen told police she wanted to create chaos, to show that tragedy could strike anywhere without warning, even on a routine morning flight full of innocent people. She'd used her airline employee access to get into the catering facility where they prepared in-flight meals and contaminated an entire batch of breakfast sandwiches with a heavy dose of sedative medication she'd been prescribed for insomnia. But then she saw my name on the passenger manifest for Flight 237, and she recognized it. I was the woman from the Denver flight who'd reminded her so much of her daughter. She couldn't go through with letting me be on that plane. The 12 passengers who got sick all recovered within 2 days. The drug Helen used was strong enough to cause severe nausea, disorientation, and distress, but it wasn't lethal at the dose she'd used. She was charged with multiple federal crimes, including reckless endangerment, attempted assault, tampering with consumer products, and terrorism-related offenses. Her trial happened 8 months later, and she pleaded guilty to all charges. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. I didn't attend the trial. I couldn't bring myself to be in the same room with her, but I followed the news coverage closely. The media called it the grief-stricken flight attendant case, and it became a national conversation about mental health screening for airline employees and access to secure areas. I stayed in Seattle instead of flying to Miami that day. I couldn't get on another airplane. I called my boss and told her I had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie because my dad drove straight to my apartment and stayed with me for almost a week. Leah came too. We didn't talk much about what happened at first. I just needed them near me. The FBI called multiple times for follow-up interviews and connected me with a trauma counselor who specialized in near-miss experiences. It took me almost 6 months before I could fly again. When I finally did, it was to visit Leah in Boston, where she'd moved for a new teaching job. My dad came with me on that first flight. I didn't sleep at all. I watched every single person who walked past my row. I kept my hand on my bag the entire time, but nothing happened. The flight was boring and normal and routine. 3 months after Helen's arrest, I received a letter that had been forwarded through the FBI. It was from Helen, written from jail. The FBI had screened it to make sure it wasn't threatening before passing it to me. Helen wrote about her daughter, about the grief that had consumed her and twisted her thinking into something dark and dangerous. She apologized for the terror I'd experienced that morning at the airport. She explained that when she saw me sleeping on that Denver flight months ago, peaceful and young and alive, it had given her a brief moment of comfort during the worst period of her life. I reminded her of what she'd lost. When she planned what she did to Flight 237, She told herself she was making some kind of statement about how unfair life was. But when she saw my name on the passenger list, she realized she couldn't hurt someone who represented her daughter's memory to her. She said she hoped I would never experience the kind of devastating loss that breaks a person so completely they stop thinking clearly. I read that letter twice, and then put it in a drawer. I never responded to it. I'm 34 now, more than a year after everything happened. I still have the photograph tucked away in my desk drawer, though I'm not entirely sure why I kept it. Maybe it's a reminder that life is stranger and more fragile than we want to believe. Maybe it's proof that trusting your instincts matters, even when they don't make logical sense. I think about those 12 passengers often, and how a single person's breakdown disrupted all their lives. I think about Helen's daughter, and how her death created a ripple effect that almost became so much worse. Most of all, I think about the decision I made that morning to trust a warning from a complete stranger, to listen to my father's worried voice, to choose safety over convenience and logic. That decision kept me off a plane that became a national news story. I don't believe in fate or divine intervention or psychic warnings, but I do believe in paying attention to the signals the world sends you, even when they come in the strangest forms. I believe in trusting the people who love you when they tell you something feels wrong, and I believe that sometimes the most illogical choice is actually the smartest one you can make. If this story made you think about the warnings you've ignored or the instincts you've dismissed because they didn't make sense, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Stay safe out there, and remember that sometimes the quietest voice in your head is the one you need to listen to most.